Okay, this is our Simondon reading group, or sorry, not Simondon anymore, Merleau Ponty reading group. We're picking up from page 115 of the PDF of Structures of Behavior that we're continuing reading. Yeah, we're still on chapter 2. These chapters are fairly long. I think there's only 4 chapters in the book. But we're looking at, so the last session we talked about these sort of 3 levels of, what does he call them? 3, sorry, just going back to get the exact terminology he uses. Forms, right. Yeah, forms of behavior, yeah. So the first one, so this is sort of a progression in terms of the like flexibility and adaptability of different kinds of behavior. So starting from like the most sort of automatic and least flexible kind of behavior to like the most flexible kind of behavior. So the first one he calls syncretic forms. So these are instances where the organism's behavior is essentially just triggered by a particular kind of stimulus or a particular kind of perceptual experience. So there's a kind of a direct correspondence between this experience and this response. But, so the difference between this and the sort of reflex theory that he's been criticizing is that here the experience of the organism is not like an atomic stimulus. It's not just like a sensation of red or something like that. It's a whole sort of complex. So it can be like a certain shape on a certain background, for example, will cause the organism to respond in a particular way. So and this sort of accounts for the types of effects that were discovered when people started to try to apply the reflex theory, where like, you know, you have a supposed reflex that happens when the organism gets a certain stimulus, but if it gets another stimulus first, then the original stimulus doesn't work anymore, or something like that. So all these different sort of counteracting effects of the relationships between stimuli. So all that is sort of, instead of having this complicated idea of like a stimulus and then an inhibition of the stimulus and disinhibition of the inhibition and so on, we're instead treating the perceptual input or the perceptual experience of the organism as a sort of complex structured whole, even in the case of these sort of simple behaviors. So like one of the examples that he gives is a toad in this experimental setup is presented with an earthworm, and then the toad responds by trying to grab the earthworm to eat it. So here, of course, you know, perceiving an earthworm is a lot more complicated than having a sensation of red or having a certain tone sensation or whatever. An earthworm image, or like the form of an earthworm, is a sort of complex of some sort of color contrast with the ground or the background, like a visual perception, some sort of shape, like it has to be the right sort of elongated shape, I guess. Probably movement as well, like a certain pattern of movement indicates that it's a worm. So all these things have to sort of line up properly for the toad to perceive this as a worm. But when that happens, then the toad just responds in this sort of automatic way of trying to grasp and eat the worm. And this happens even in the case where, in the experiment that he describes here, there's a piece of glass between the toad and the worm. So the toad can't get to the worm, but it just keeps trying over and over again, even though it's failed, 10, 20, whatever times, it just keeps trying the same thing. So it's here we see that the toad is not learning in the way that the sort of reflex theory would expect us to see. So it doesn't, have this negative experience or this experience of failure and then stop performing that behavior and do something different. It just, keeps doing this behavior over and over again. So like certain organisms have, and probably all organisms to some extent, like even in humans, we have, some of the sort of simple behaviors like dilation or contraction of our pupils are things that we can't even control, even if we like, read about it and are knowledgeable about this action. Your pupil will still dilate or contract depending on the lighting, no matter what you want them to do. So yeah, these sort of automatic responses are part of human behavior, but obviously not the primary form of behavior in human beings, whereas organisms like toads or maybe other organisms, their sort of repertoire of behaviors is primarily made up of these simple responses to a certain experience, a certain perception. So that's sort of the most basic form. The next level is what he calls immovable forms. So here it's not this sort of very direct connection between the perception and the behavioral response. Instead, it's a kind of adaptive response to a perceptual situation. So the example that he gives here is, or one example that he gives is these chickens are presented with two piles of grain or food of whatever kind, and one of them, I guess there's like a label or like, there's like a sign or whatever, next to the pile or on top of the pile, and the two piles have different colors assigned to them or different shades of gray assigned to them. So a dark gray and a light gray, and you can train the chickens to respond to the difference in the shade of gray by giving them, like, the light gray side has the better food, the food that they prefer, and the dark gray has the less good food, or vice versa. It doesn't really matter which one. You can train the chickens to respond to the light gray as the sign for preferred food. But then you can switch up the actual precise shades of gray. You can make what was the dark gray. You can take that and make it into the light gray with an even darker shade of gray. And then the chickens still respond. They still select the lighter shade of gray. So they're not sort of keyed onto one particular shade of gray. They actually are recognizing that what is significant here is the difference between the two shades of gray. So they're learning a relational property of a certain setup that, like, the lighter gray is the sign of good food, as opposed to this particular shade of gray is the sign of good food. So again, they're not like, the difference here is that they're not sort of automatically connecting one experience to one behavioral response. They're instead grasping a certain structure of a situation, a very simple structure, in this case, just lighter and darker. But they're responding to it and behaving in accordance with their grasp of this simple structure. And then so this is obviously a very simple instance of this kind of immovable form. But there are more complex ones, like some of the examples he gives are the classic animal psychology experiment with rats navigating a maze. Here he wants us to understand what the rat learns, not as just a sort of sequence of specific movements in response to specific visual perceptions. So like that would be a very sort of reflex theory or behaviorist conception of what the rat is learning. So you would say that, like, the rat learns that I run 1 meter and then I see this shape and then I turn right and then run another meter, etc. Like a very specific sequence of perceptions and motions. That's not what the rat actually learns, or according to Merleau Ponty, what the rat learns instead is a grasp of the spatial layout of the maze. And one piece of evidence that he takes for this is that the rats respond differently to a sequence of two mazes versus a single maze that requires the same sequence of motions as the two mazes in sequence. So like you take a very simple maze that just has two left turns, so it's left, and then you reach the goal where the food is. And then there's another simple maze that's just two right turns, so it's right. You can train the rat to learn each of these types of maze, so it learns, turn left twice or turn right twice. But then if you alternate these two types of maze, so you put the rat through a maze where it has to go left twice, and then you put it through a maze that has to go right twice, and you keep going back and forth between left and right. The rat never learns this sequence. It doesn't like figure out that, last time I went left twice, so this time I have to go right twice. But on the other hand, if you give it a maze that's twice as long, where it has to go left twice, then right twice, and then reaches its goal, the rat does learn the sequence to navigate this maze. So it's doing the exact same sequence of movements, left twice, then right twice. But in this case, it's learned the spatial orientation of this maze, as opposed to a temporal sequence of the same movements that it wasn't capable of learning. So what this shows for Merleau-Ponty is that the rat is not learning this temporal sequence of movements. It's actually learning the spatial layout of the maze. Even though the sequence of movements is the same in both cases, it's actually incapable of learning one and capable of learning the other. So again, this sort of shows that this kind of behavior is not just a sort of sequence of individual perceptions and individual behavioral responses. It's learning this spatial structure and how to situate. The animal learns how to situate itself in that spatial structure. It knows, like, I'm at the beginning of the maze, or I'm approaching the end of the maze, or whatever. It can sort of find its way. It can orient itself in relation to its understanding of the layout of the maze. So yeah, it's this is obviously much more significantly more sophisticated kind of learning and behavior compared to the very simple syncretic forms that the toad exhibited. But yeah, so this like obviously this is sophisticated in certain ways, and we can see like many animals. We talked about this last time about like animals that are capable of responding to these very subtle cues in humans, domestic animals in particular. That can respond to these very subtle cues in humans that often we don't even recognize. So like your dog might sort of like understand that you're about to leave on a trip, like just based on some subtle pattern of like the way you're moving around the house or whatever, and you might not even know what it is that the dog is responding to, but the dog has learned this pattern. When the human does this, then they're leaving for a trip, or they're going to be gone for a long time or whatever. And so they like learn this subtle pattern of different perceptual inputs being assigned for something. So this is quite sophisticated in certain ways, but also at the same time he describes some of the limits of this kind of learning in the case of monkeys, for example, that are capable of figuring out how to use certain tools. So like they're in a cage and there's a banana or some other desirable food outside the cage that they can't reach. They can learn how to use a rake to to sort of drag the banana towards themselves, but only if the rake and the banana are sort of present in the same point of view. So like you can see the rake and the banana next to each other, and then the monkey can go, okay, I can use this rake to grab this banana. But if you have like the banana on one side of the cage and the rake on the other side, the monkey won't figure out that if I take this rake from one side and bring it over to the other side, then I can use the rake to grab the banana. So like they're capable of some sophisticated kinds of learning in certain circumstances, but then in other circumstances they can't sort of take two isolated pieces of information or two parts of the environment and like put them together in the way that would allow them to solve some problem. Or like, again, another example of this is like the monkeys are capable of using a rake or a stick or something to grab the banana. But if there's a bush in the middle of their cage with branches that they could easily just break off and use for the same purpose, they never figure out that they could do this. The bush is just a sort of obstacle or something that they like avoid or whatever. They don't actually have this sort of restructuring of perception that says like this branch of a bush is something that I could detach and use to reach for the banana. So there's a certain, even though there's flexibility in learning how to use different tools and learning how to adapt to the environment in different ways, there's like a sort of a fixity to the purpose. So like each tool, each element of the environment is like directly tied to a particular goal. Like here, the rake and the banana are like tied together by the fact that the monkey can see them next to each other, and the rake becomes sort of experienced as the thing to grab bananas with or whatever. But once it has this experience of the rake as the banana grabbing thing, it would be hard for it to sort of perceive the rake as like some other kind of tool. I don't know exactly what, but use it for some other purpose. Or like the bush is just perceived as an obstacle, and then it can't sort of detach itself from this perception of the bush and see the properties of these branches as long rigid objects that could potentially be used for grabbing things. And so it never like detaches itself from this very practical perception of the elements of its environment, and then sort of readapts how it sees the object and makes it available for other kinds of use. So it's again flexible in certain respects, but also fixed in other respects, in comparison to human perception and use of objects, which I don't think we got to that part yet. So yeah, so this is the second level, and there's going to be a third level that we haven't gotten to, which is the symbolic level. But so yeah, just to sort of anticipate a little bit, you can see how like human tool use or even like spatial experience. We talked about this a little bit last time. Like our grasp of space involves not just sort of the practical relationship to objects in our perceptual environment. So like I can recognize that certain objects are within my grasp and others are distant, have this sort of immediate perceptual experience of space around me. But I also have like, even in a very vague sense, some idea of like where I am in the world. Like I'm located in this city, which is in this country or whatever. I'm, a certain distance from this river, etc. Like all these things that require knowledge, not just of my immediate surroundings, but some sort of reference to a global location framework. So and this is often mediated by things like maps, which involve some sort of symbolic depiction of a territory, or it can be like a numerical distance, like a certain number of kilometers, etc. So these are all symbolic references to some sort of spatial structure that, and again, like even animals that have very sophisticated navigation capacities, you think of like birds that fly thousands of kilometers from their feeding grounds in the south to the nesting sites in the north, etc., or fish that travel back to a certain stream. These are still these navigation techniques or capacities don't involve some sort of global symbolic reference. They don't sort of understand themselves as being like in a location in reference to some global framework of like a sort of representation of the world as a whole. So this is where we're going to get to when we get to the symbolic level. I think we should get to that today. Okay, so that was a sort of a long summary of where we are, but yeah, we can dive into the rest of the text from page 115 if someone would like to pick up from the top of the page.
I can read. This is probably why the chimpanzee... I'm going to go up so that it makes more sense. If chimpanzees are presented with several cords, which all go toward a goal, but only one of which is attached to the fruit, they grasp any one just as often as the others. Their behavior is not governed by the mechanical relation of the cord to the goal. It depends much more on the length of the cords presented, the shorter being the most frequently chosen. This is probably why the chimpanzee fails as soon as the mechanical relations which de facto exist become complicated, since they can no longer be translated into the imperfect equivalents possessed by animal behavior. The chimpanzee can neither untie a knot nor separate a ring from a nail on which it is hung. Thus, a sort of animal physics immanent in behavior could be described, but its originality could only be understood by a psychology and philosophy capable of making a place for the indeterminate as such, capable of comprehending that a mode of behavior or an experience can have a quote-unquote vague, quote-unquote open signification without being empty of signification. A young chimpanzee, in the presence of fruit hanging from the ceiling and a box placed in its cage, begins by jumping toward the goal in order to attain it directly. Its eye then falls on the box. Quote, it approached it, looked straight toward the objective, and gave the box a slight push, which did not, however, move it. It lifted the box, took a few paces away from it, but at once returned and pushed it again and again with its eye on the objective, but quite gently, not as though it really intended to alter its position. Unquote. A few moments later, the solution would be quote unquote found. One could say that the box, quote, had something to do, unquote, with the problem, but that the function has not yet been made precise. Will it ever be completely? The verbal behavior of man furnishes an analogy. In Ruger's puzzle experiment, when a subject succeeds accidentally in separating two pieces, quote, the region in which the work is being done, or the particular kind of movement that is being made, is now emphasized and becomes the focus of the whole procedure. In a large number of cases, the solution, therefore, is almost a matter of locus or place analysis, unquote. But the manner in which such a local intervention will produce the expected effect does not enter into the reaction. Again, one can think of the situations which set in motion the reaction of the player in a game of tennis. We would express this situation in a later analysis by saying that the direction of the ball, the angle which the trajectory makes with the court, the rotation with which the ball can be animated, the position of the adversaries, and the dimension of the court all contribute in regulating the strength and direction of the response, the manner in which the ball will be hit in return. But it is clear that the situation at the moment of the hit itself is not articulated so completely, even though with a good player all these determinations enter in. An analogous problem is posed by the description of the behavior of chimpanzees with regard to mechanical relations, which must be poorly distinguished in them from, quote, visual context, unquote, and must belong to an original category comparable to those of the physics of children or to the, quote unquote, participation of primitives. The same can be said concerning static relations, which are very lacunar in chimpanzees. One of Kohler's subjects, in order to balance a ladder, places one of the sides against the wall. The static characteristics of the situation enter in by way of interoceptivity rather than by the intermediary of the visual receptors. The chimpanzee treats a box as if it were in a state of equilibrium when it does not wobble at all, even if that equilibrium is very unstable, and on the other hand, recommences his whole construction if the box, firmly set on its base, is nevertheless not absolutely immobile. Once the construction has been made, quote, every movement or every suspicious inclination is admirably counteracted by a displacement of the center of gravity of the body, a raising of the arm, or a bending of the trunk so that the boxes themselves under the animal obey, to a certain extent, the statics of its labyrinth cerebellum, unquote. Quote, structures grow under its hands often enough to climb them, but they are structures which, according to the rules of statics, seem to us almost impossible. For all the structures which we know and are familiar with optically are achieved by monkeys by chance at best, and as it were, by a struggle for wobble, unquote. So with these later examples, it seems like the point is that the chimpanzees handle building these structures on the basis of the sense of movement, the whether or not it feels stable on the basis of whether it's wobbling or not, rather than sort of looking at it and determining by examining the object itself whether the structure that has been made is actually going to, I guess, sustain the weight of the chimpanzee. It's more about the feel of it, I guess.
Yeah. So here, like, you can see this in like young kids as well. Like, they'll try to like stack up blocks on top of each other, but like they put the bigger block on top of the smaller block, and then the whole thing falls down. So like obviously, like once kids reach a certain age, I don't know, 4 or 5 or whatever, they figure out like they just have a sort of intuitive grasp of, you know, the bigger block can only be stable underneath the smaller block, and so you have to put the big blocks on the bottom, and then they can just sort of intuitively see, you know, which structures are stable and which ones are unstable. And the chimpanzees never reach this point. So even adult chimpanzees, in their interaction with like boxes and ladders and so on, these sort of artificial environments, they like put things together in ways that don't actually make sense in terms of like building a stable structure, and then they just sort of rely on their built-in or their automatic balancing capabilities of like adjusting the center of gravity of the body, moving their arms, etc. To sort of hang on to this structure that is not very stable. They just instead of like having a sort of grasp of the principles or the sort of dynamics of a structure that would have a stable form. Instead, they rely on this sort of bodily capacity of adjusting balance in a shifting environment. And from an evolutionary perspective, this makes a lot of sense because animals that are moving around through tree branches, for example, the branches are always bending and moving in the wind and so on. And so like their sort of natural environment is one where they're mostly not moving on stable platforms or stable structures. They're just like constantly adjusting to this movement. And so there's no like sort of evolutionary reason why they would have a grasp of how to recognize that a certain structure is stable, because they're always just used to this adjustment process. So in this artificial setting of the laboratory, they never acquired this skill, and so they just rely on this ability to adjust their balance and then they never like grasp how to put together boxes and ladders and so on in a way that won't fall down. They just keep building these unstable structures that last just long enough for them to grasp the fruit and then fall down. So Bats has put a question in the chat here. Would we have acquired the skill to build more stable constructions if we had their balancing capabilities and thus had less need for it? It's an interesting question. So humans, of course, in evolutionary history, in the early development of hominids, left a sort of forest environment for grassland environment, and instead of moving through trees, humans evolved to walk on the ground, and the ground is mostly stable, and we have much less need to balance in shifting tree branches or similar types of environments, and so our ability to keep our balance in this situation is probably much less sophisticated, much less accurate than in the case of chimpanzees. And then, so you can maybe, as a sort of counterfactual thing, like, in this circumstance, like if we, for whatever reason, did have this very accurate capacity to maintain our balance like chimpanzees do, maybe we wouldn't have ever, thought to or developed this capacity to build structures that are stable. We never would have needed to exercise this capacity. So here you can see how like a certain, from one perspective, there's a deficiency in the case of humans where we lack a certain capacity that chimpanzees have, or have a much less capable form of what the chimpanzees have. But this also provides a certain opportunity to exercise a different set of skills that is more flexible in other respects. So obviously we can build, not just stacks of boxes that sort of hold up long enough to grab a piece of fruit and then collapse. We can build, houses that last decades, bridges, etc. All these things that chimpanzees never build. So there's like, I guess a certain lack of this very direct behavioral balance capability that is compensated for by this more indirect construction of environments where that balance is not needed anymore, because you've built a foundation and a floor in your building that doesn't require you to shift your balance on a regular basis. I guess another way of thinking about it is there's sort of two alternate strategies. Like if you're dealing with an environment that involves sort of uncertainty and shifting conditions, the two alternate ways of dealing with this are, one, to acquire the skill of responding to these shifts in a way that sort of keeps you directed towards whatever your goal is, and that's what the chimpanzee does. It just sort of shifts its balance as the tree branches sway or whatever. The other alternative is to change the environment so that it doesn't have this kind of shifting anymore. And this is, in different circumstances, characteristic of human responses to this kind of shifting environment, where we, build houses and pave the streets or whatever to make sure that they have this stability that we need to be able to operate in this kind of environment. So yeah, you can either shift your own behavior to adapt to the shifting environment, or you can stabilize the environment so that you don't need to do that shift anymore. And so these are just sort of two different ways of approaching an environment that has this kind of shifting quality. Okay, we can go on to the next bit. If someone can read from If We Say.
Here, I can read. If we say now that the chimpanzee is intelligent, do we not risk forgetting the original characteristics of the physico-geometric relations in its behavior and confusing them with the objective geometry and physics of man? Doubtless definitions are free, and the one which Kähler gives of intelligence seems appropriate to the chimpanzee. Kähler takes as criterion, quote, the appearance of a complete solution without reference to the whole layout of the field, and the appearance of behavior, the constituent parts of which, quote, taken separately are meaningless in relation to the task, but which become significant again when they are considered as part of the whole. But the structure of the field can be more or less articulated, that of behavior more or less complex. And also, is there only a difference of degree between the static and mechanical structures of the chimpanzee and those of human behavior? Is the insufficiency of the static relations in the chimpanzee only a, quote, visual infirmity, following Kähler's expression, that is, in brief, a deficit comparable to blindness? Or is it not rather, inasmuch as these relations presuppose a superior mode of structuration, that they are inaccessible to the chimpanzee? And is it not to this mode of organization that the term, quote, intelligence ought to be reserved? We have seen that the box as seat and the box as instrument are two distinct and alternative objects in the behavior of the chimpanzee, and not two aspects of an identical thing. In other words, the animal cannot at each moment adopt a point of view with regard to objects which is chosen at its discretion. Rather, the object appears clothed with a vector invested with a functional value which depends on the effective composition of the field. For us, this is the principle of the insufficiencies that are noticed in the chimpanzee's behavior. We would like to establish this principle by means of two examples, that of the detour with objects and that of static relations. The chimpanzees, who are presented with the task of obtaining a piece of fruit separated from them by the vertical sides of a box, and who must push the food away from them towards the open edge of the box in order to succeed, can all make detours such as going outside to look for a piece of fruit that has been thrown through the window. Thus it is clear that executing a detour and arranging that one be made at the goal constitute two different and unequally difficult tasks for the animal organism. The spatial relations in the two cases must present some difference of nature. They are accessible to animal behavior only in one direction, that is when their pattern consists in a movement of the organism towards the goal. The goal is the fixed point, the organism the mobile point, and they cannot exchange their functions. The organism is not an object among objects, it possesses a privilege. What is it that prevents exteroceptive structures from acquiring the same plasticity which is found in proprioceptive structures? The analogy of human behavior in certain cases of agnosia and in fatigue furnishes an example. It is easier to go through a complicated itinerary than to explain it to somebody or someone, and often in the course of the explanation we make use of a motor mimic, without which we would not be able to go through the route mentally, especially if we are tired. We have encountered the same recourse to motor attitudes in Gelb and Goldstein's patient. It is not sufficient to say that we appeal to kinesthetic data in order to make up for the faltering visual data. One would have to know precisely why they are faltering. Moreover, the motor attitudes are not substituted for the visual data. As a matter of fact, the gestures of orientation have a meaning in this case only in relation to some visual representation of the route which we form for ourselves. What the motor attitude contributes is not the content, but rather the power of organizing the visual spectacle, of tracing the relations which we need between the points of represented space. The alleged recourse to tactile data is in reality a recourse to lived space, in opposition to the virtual space in which our indications were situated at first. By the gestures which we sketch, we make the principal directions of the virtual field, in which our description is unfolding, coincide momentarily with the strong structures, right and left, high and low, of our own body. The difficulty of a pure description of the itinerary is of the same order as that of reading a map or of orienting oneself on a plan, and it is known that a plan is practically unusable precisely in certain cases of agnosia. The purely visual sketch demands that we represent the itinerary for ourselves from a bird's eye view, from a point of view which has never been ours when we traversed it. It demands that we be capable of transcribing a kinetic melody into a visual diagram, of establishing relations of reciprocal correspondence and mutual expression between them. In the same manner, arranging that a detour to an object be made is to trace by our very gesture the symbol of the movement which we would have to make if we were in its place. It is to establish a relation between relations. It is a structure or an intention of the second power.
We can stop here. Sorry. We had one short paragraph and then one like multi-page paragraph, so we have to stop like in the middle. Thanks. The question here is like, what do we want? How do we want to characterize these animal behaviors, like the chimpanzee, using the tool in certain circumstances, but then failing to grasp how to use the tool in other circumstances? And in particular, how do we sort of compare this kind of behavior to human behavior? There's always like one of the sort of key central questions in animal psychology is always like trying to rank animals' intelligence. Like, how does this animal's intelligence compare to a human child, for example? Is a dog smarter than a pig, or is a monkey smarter than this other kind of monkey or whatever? These questions are to some extent artificial because we're just comparing, like, animals each have their own sort of form of life, and they're just sort of doing different things, and so like comparing one with another is kind of unfair in certain respects. So the question here is like, when we see the chimpanzee like not being able to grasp that it can use the branch in a certain way, or that it has to put the boxes together in this way for the structure to be stable, etc. Can we just describe this as like an incapacity on the part of the chimpanzee compared to a human capacity? And so he's arguing here that we shouldn't see this as like sort of an absence of something that humans have. Like the chimpanzee is not just like a human minus certain capacities. What instead is the better way of understanding the way that the chimpanzee is using these objects is that each of them is sort of embedded in a function, so it always perceives the object in relation to what it can do with this object. A box is something to sit on, or an annoying obstacle in the middle of the cage, or it's like in certain circumstances, depending on where it's oriented in relation to the fruit it's trying to grasp, it might sort of the box as something to climb on. But each of these sort of perceptions of the box is like a sort of separate object in a certain respect. It doesn't like grasp the box as an object with a variety of properties that could be put to different uses. And so this is also something we can sort of compare with agnosia and also behavior of normal humans, or humans without any sort of brain injury, in circumstances of fatigue. Because in each of these cases, you have something similar where you sort of lose your capacity to grasp the object as an object with a variety of properties that is related in different ways to different objects. Instead, you just sort of react to the object in this very sort of direct way, as opposed to this more like more conceptually mediated way. And so he talks here about navigating as like an example of this. So you can think of like walking to work or walking to the grocery store or something like some sort of route that you take every day or every multiple times a week or whatever, you know this route very well. But if someone asks you like to describe the route, it might be a little bit difficult to say like you walk 300 meters north and then you turn left and then you etc. Like this kind of abstract description of the route in symbolic terms is not necessarily easy to convey, and you might find yourself like if someone asks you to describe this route, you sort of have to run through it in your head and maybe even like perform little sort of motions to like turn left or whatever to sort of like simulate the trajectory that you would take to get from one place to the other. And I think this kind of like difference between the sort of lived space, this space that we navigate in our motions around the world, compared to like a geometric space or a space that we grasp, conceptually. You can think about like, imagine trying to explain to someone how to tie your shoes. Like I wouldn't have any, like I have no idea how I would explain that to someone who has never, experienced this before, or how to like, program a computer how to tie a shoelace, for example. But obviously each of us does this, every day, more or less, and something that we can just do without even thinking about it. But like, if you wanted to try to explain it to someone, you would have to like, sort of simulate. Like, you probably have to like, do the actual motions and then describe what you're doing. Another example would be like, trying to learn how to ride a bike by reading a book about riding bikes. Like, obviously, if you just read a bike riding textbook or whatever, and then go to the bike store and pick up a bike and hop on it, you're not going to be able to ride a bike. You have to actually learn how to adapt your motion and your balance and everything to make the bike stay up and keep moving. Riding a bike, even if you are a skilled cyclist, if you try to explain to someone how do you like keep your balance while you're riding a bike, it's not really describable. Like, you just have to sort of learn that this motion is what is required in this circumstance when the angle is this or whatever. It's just a sort of felt and lived adaptation to the shifting of the bike and your feeling of balance. So this is obviously a very different type of relationship to the environment, to the spatial orientation of the world around us, compared to looking at a map and figuring out where you are and where your goal is and so on. And so like this sort of bodily lived relationship to the environment is what he wants us to sort of picture or to understand these different animal relationships to the environment. So everything, it's as if everything in a chimpanzee's life is like tying your shoelaces, where you can perform this skill very reliably. You can even like adapt to different types of shoelaces or whatever without too much trouble. But like, there's no sort of viewpoint from outside the experience where you can like, in a very conceptual and symbolic way, represent what it is you're doing. And so it's as if everything, like in a chimpanzee, it sort of responds to its whole world. Its whole life is sort of made up of this kind of experience, where it's just very directly sort of integrated into its actions without having this sort of external perspective on it. Whereas humans, we can generally, like, to varying degrees, depending on what type of activity it is, we can sort of shift between these two perspectives. We can, like when you're walking to work, you can sort of, respond in this very adaptive way to the environment as you're moving. But then, say like suddenly, there's construction on the sidewalk you normally use, and you have to take a different route. You can still adjust and know that, there's a different route if I go, 1 block west or whatever. You still have a sort of global grasp of the situation that allows you to situate where you are and where you're trying to go and figure out a new way of getting there. Whereas the chimpanzee, in a sort of analogous situation might just end up feeling, blocked and frustrated and not know what to do. So yeah, so humans have this capacity to sort of step outside the sort of lived, running through the experience and situate it in a sort of conceptual space that chimpanzees or other animals don't have, or have at least much less capacity to do compared to humans.
There were 2 points Merleau made here about like the immobility of the object. Actually, I think I might talk about this a little bit further down too. But this idea that the chimpanzee has difficulty with with pushing the piece of fruit away in order to get it, whereas if they see the piece of fruit thrown out the window, they can easily make a detour outside. And then, where exactly you said it, but he says something to the effect that, he says that the animal can't put itself in the place of the movable thing and see itself as the goal. So like different uses or different comportments to the same object aren't seen as different perspectives on the same thing. In a way, they would be if you use the box, use the box at use A and use it differently to be, they're really two different boxes as opposed to one item that can be, one object that can be seen under different aspects.
Yeah, and here in particular, like he points out that the chimpanzee's perception is always sort of egocentric in the sense that it always grasps the objects in its environment in relation to itself and its potential actions. So it can so this example, like you can picture a chimpanzee is like at a window, standing at a window, and you throw a piece of fruit outside. The chimpanzee will like move away from the window, go towards the door, go outside and grab the fruit. So it's capable of doing a detour itself, so its own body making a detour to get to the fruit. Whereas in the other circumstance where the fruit is in the box and it has to push the fruit through a detour to get it out of the box, so to push the fruit away from itself, it's incapable of learning how to do this. So there's a difference for the chimpanzee between myself doing a detour and the object making a detour, because my own body is always like the center of the world for the chimpanzee, and so it's a completely different kind of task for the chimpanzee to perform a detour oneself compared to making the fruit make a detour, whereas the human is capable of sort of substituting one for the other, of sort of picturing, if I were in the location of this piece of fruit and I wanted to get out of this box, what direction would I have to go? As sort of like a sort of image of what motion the piece of fruit has to undergo to get out of the box. So yeah, it's the human has the capacity to sort of take any point of space as the center indifferently, whereas the chimpanzee always takes its own body as the center of space and is not capable of sort of looking on its own body from outside, or of looking on an object as the center that has to be displaced, to achieve a certain goal. So this is again this sort of embeddedness of behavior in a certain spatial structure compared to the human capacity to sort of shift perspective on objects that are used for different purposes.
Yeah, it seems like that ability to, as you were saying, the ability to kind of, for the chimpanzee to, which the chimpanzee doesn't have, to put itself in the place of the goal is the same as the ability to take oneself as the object, as an object of thought from a kind of external perspective. I remember when I was reading through this initially, it made me think of the beginning of the phenomenology and this idea that, the movement in the object is the movement in the subject. But I may have had a clearer idea on that earlier, but tired now and I would have to start, I guess, kinesthetically miming the phenomenology to work my way back through the thought.
Yeah, we need to get someone to perform a interpretive dance of the phenomenology for us. I guess like in relation to the beginning of the phenomenology, like what he's talking about there is this sort of indexical quality of, or one of the points that he's making in that passage, the sense certainty part of the phenomenology is this indexical quality of perceptual experience, so that like something like this or now or here, these are these sort of conceptual grasp of something that is anchored to a particular location or moment in time, or et cetera, a person, etc. And the chimpanzee has this sort of similar indexical relationship to everything that it manipulates. So it never, or it, so it never gets beyond something like this is, useful for grabbing bananas, or here is where the bananas are given, or whatever. It just sort of has this anchored, all of its thought and behavior, or whatever you want to call thought or experience and behavior, is always anchored to this particular, whereas the human, and this is sort of the point that Hegel talks about when you write down now is night, this thought or this proposition might be true at one time and false at another time, and then we only are capable of grasping this thought, now is night, insofar as we recognize that now is related to something that is not now, to earlier or later, and the chimpanzee doesn't have this capacity to relate now to earlier and later, or here to there, in the way that humans do. So its connection, it is always indexical to the objects, and it never sort of situates that indexicality in relation to a larger structure that would sort of assign a location in space or time to each of these points that it's relating to.
Yeah, I guess that if I'm understanding correctly, with the example of the box, for example, the limitation that the chimpanzee has is that it can't willingly choose to think of the box as, or the goal or the object in general as this or that, depending on the situation, the structure that it, I guess, places that box in. He will be capable of thinking of it as something that he can use, or maybe as some obstacle or something like that, but he doesn't have the ability to, I guess, contemplate these possibilities and sort of freely choose one or the other depending on context. Would that be it?
Yeah, I think that's definitely part of it. I think there's also like this. So yeah, the sort of detour with the banana in the box. Like the idea here would be that the chimpanzee always grasps the banana in relation to here, where I am. The banana is there and I am here, whereas the human is capable of sort of displacing itself from its actual location and sort of picturing itself in the location of the banana. So I can look at the banana and I can think, if I were there, if here was the location of the banana, then to get out of the box I would have to move right, for example, or move up or whatever. And then I can, yeah, exactly. So yeah, that's why it's a sort of indexical. So yeah, it's like changing the origin of the reference frame. The chimpanzee always moves around in a frame of reference that is anchored at its location, whereas the human is capable of sort of displacing the anchor point of the frame of reference to another object. Even it could even be an object that you can't see. So you can like look at a map and say, okay, the other side of the mall that I'm trying to get to is in this direction. Even though I can't see it, I have to turn right and then go up these stairs or whatever. So yeah, you can orient your current location as being in this direction relative to a certain point in space that you grasp in this sort of geometrical sense. So we have this very indexical sort of anchored experience of grasping objects that are in front of me, or catching a baseball or whatever. But we also have this more global mediated, I guess, grasp of space, where we can displace ourselves from our current location and see that location relative to a different location, and understand what how far away are they from each other in some measure of distance. It could be approximate, or we can figure out, like, if I want to get from this point to that other point, which direction should I go, etc. So these kinds of sort of shifts of perspective are it's this capacity that the chimpanzee and the patients that are suffering from agnosia, these abilities to shift perspective, to displace yourself from the center of experience to like a certain point in relation to another point. These are the kinds of capacities that distinguish human spatial orientation and behavior from the chimpanzee. And yeah, so like I mentioned a little while ago about some of these like sort of massive migrations that certain birds and fish and so on can perform. So like there are birds that spend the winter in Florida or Mexico and then travel to northern Canada for the summer. So they're flying many thousands of kilometers, and they return to, like, say, the same lake or whatever every summer. So they're not just sort of vaguely flying north. They're capable of pretty precise navigation towards a particular spot. And I think in general these navigation capacities are not like sort of fully understood, but there's some indication that certain birds can respond to the magnetic field of the Earth in different ways. There's also I know pigeons. I'm not sure about other birds, but they can hear infrasound. So human sound perception goes down to about 20 hertz, and pigeons can hear somewhere on 5 hertz, so considerably lower than humans. And in this frequency range, there's actually sort of like a geographic scale of sound. So like mountain ranges, for example, the wind like passing around a mountain produces a kind of low infrasound wave that the bird can hear. And so in some respects, the bird is like navigating by hearing the geography of the landscape that it's flying over. So here again, the bird is not sort of representing a globe in its head and like tracing a line and saying this is the direction I need to fly. It's sort of responding to these shifting cues in the environment that, like, when I hear this infrasound, I turn and at this angle and travel in this direction, etc. So it's a very sophisticated capacity of navigation. And there's, of course, the famous homing pigeons that you can take hundreds of kilometers away from their nest and then release, and then they find their way home. But they're doing it through this very sophisticated adaptation to signals coming from the environment, as opposed to like sort of representing where they are in a sort of spatial grid compared to the home base. So yeah, it's not that one is like better in some sense or even more sophisticated in any way than the other. It's just that these are like very different relationships to spatial orientation, that either this sophisticated sensory grasp of different properties that allow you to navigate an environment in the case of the pigeons, or in our case, this sort of symbolic geometric representation of a spatial structure and situating yourself in relation to that structure. And these are sort of two alternate ways of like navigating a complex environment where you are trying to reach a goal that you can't perceive at the outset of your journey. Okay, so we can go on to the next bit. I think we are at, sorry, where are we? Top of 118, I believe. What is lacking in the chimpanzee, is that right? Cool. Bats, would you like to read?
Okay. What is lacking in the chimpanzee is the capacity of creating relations between visual stimuli and between the motor excitations which they elicit, which express and symbolize its most familiar kinetic method. The animal cannot put itself in the place of the movable thing and see itself as a goal. It cannot vary the points of view, just as it cannot recognize something in different perspectives as the same thing. But perhaps it will be said that we are presupposing a privilege of actuality in favor of the proprioceptive stimulation. It is only on this condition that the movements which ought to be imprinted on the object have need of a translation into proprioceptive language, and that symbolic behavior is required. Why is the detour of the object not just as actual as the detour of the body proper? This is because in animal behavior, the external object is not a thing in a sense that the body itself is, that is, a concrete unity capable of entering into a multiplicity of relations without losing itself. As a matter of fact, we do come up against the privilege of the body proper, and it can only be a question of defining it correctly. What is really lacking in the animal is the symbolic behavior which it will have to possess in order to find an invariant in the external object, under the diversity of its aspect, comparable to the immediately given invariant of the body proper, and in order to treat reciprocally its own body as an object amongst objects. In the same manner, the monkey, which knows how to balance itself so well, that is, to re-establish the vertical position of its body by appropriate movements, does not succeed in balancing its construction. This is because the balancing of an object demands the establishment of a one-to-one correspondence between certain spatial relations of visual stimuli and certain interoceptive stimuli as representative of each other. But this solution, it will be said, presupposes what is to be explained. Why do visual stimuli need to be related to interoceptive stimuli in order to be qualified according to the high and the low, the quote-unquote vertical and the quote-unquote oblique? And how does it happen that the proper structures do not admit of this dimension? Kuller indicates somewhere that chimpanzees never construct bridges, and that when a bridge is presented to them, one sees them get onto it, pull one of the arches, and give quote-unquote signs of fright when the whole thing collapses. Here in quotes. All other experiments, Kuller adds, in which in principle the simultaneous intervention of two forces plays a role, have failed as this one did. Should not the failure of the animal when it is a matter of moving a piece of fruit away in order to subsequently to bring it nearer, or its failure in relating two perpendicular components, as happens in the test with the ring and the nail, and in that of the knot or of the cord wrapped around the beam, be related to these experiments? And is not the same explanation still valid for the quote-unquote maladresse of the animal in the construction trials? For here again, it is a question of establishing a correlation between two distinct forces, of simultaneously satisfying two conditions, the proper cohesion of the scaffolding and the orientation of the whole with respect to the vertical. The same difficulty is not found in the balancing of the body proper, in which case the quote-unquote scaffolding is already constructed. Thus, it is not properly an optical weakness, quote-unquote, which is involved, or rather the visual infirmity is itself a result. The insufficiency of visual statics comes from the fact that, in the domain of external objects to which vision is related, equilibrium is obtained by the combining of two independent forces. Thus, it is a question of treating two things as one, two forces as the analytic expression of a resultant which has no element in common with them. The visual infirmity only expresses the insufficiency of the relations of reciprocal expression, of symbolic behavior, or again of the quote-unquote thing structure. Vision is imperfect only because it is the sense modality of the virtual, and indeed, in the detour experiments with objects, each time a chance movement of the goal anticipates the solution, the chimpanzee profits from this indication. This is because the chance movement has transposed the problem from virtual space, where it ought to be resolved by possible operations, into actual space, where it begins to be effectively resolved. It is always the same behavioral incapacity to treat the whole field as a field of things, to multiply the relations in which a stimulus can be involved, and to treat all of them as different properties of the same thing which is in question. Yeah, I don't know, I had never read Maladresse before either. Okay, so as I understand it, this is kind of similar to what we were talking about earlier, of these limitations with regards to like the possibility of thinking of an object in all the different modalities on one hand, and also of separating, themselves from this here and now kind of situation, the indexical context that we talked earlier, basically showing some sort of continuity or perhaps an interpretation of the other experiments in which the chimpanzees fail as all being evidence of a failure to grasp objects in this more like modal plane in this realm of possibility. Would that be well? That's what I got out of.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think here, so he's the way he's explaining this is that the chimpanzee always has sort of the locus of possibility in its own body. So its body is capable of performing a variety of different actions. It has, it can grasp things, it can jump, it can run, etc. My body for the chimpanzee is where possibility sort of resides, whereas everything else in the world is just sort of a certain correspondent to a certain possibility of my body. So like the rake is something I can use to extend my reaching capacity, for example. Whereas and so what is lacking in this case compared to the human is the capacity to situate possibilities, alternate possibilities in other objects. So I can see the branch of the bush as a potential rake, whereas the chimpanzee can't make this sort of grasp of an object as having a potential that is different from its current sort of use. And then sort of the converse side of this is that the chimpanzee can't treat its own body as an object among others in the way that a human can. So like you can, a human can, sort of try to visualize, what would my face look like seen from outside, or what sort of orientation of my body would would someone else see from this perspective, and so on. You can sort of locate your body as an object in relation to other bodies in a way that the chimpanzee can't. So yeah, these are sort of two sides of the same capacity of grasping the spatial environment as the sort of field of possibilities, or this virtual field as he describes it. Whereas for the chimpanzee, this potential, or the sort of possibilities of the world are all sort of pointing outwards from my own body. Every possibility only exists in relation to my body for the chimpanzee, whereas the human has this capacity of grasping possibilities, in both directions, either outward from my body or sort of radiating from other objects. And yeah, so here he points out that this our sort of grasp of something as a thing, as a treating something as a thing as opposed to just a sort of means of performing a certain action, sort of requires that you be able to grasp it as containing multiple properties that are all sort of united in a thing. So like if I grasp a book, for example, as a thing, it's something, obviously, sort of the standard use of a book is to read, but I could use it to as a doorstop. I could use it to prop up my monitor on my desk. I could throw it at someone, etc. You can use a book for many other things. This capacity to grasp this one object as having many potential uses, or fitting into many potential circumstances, or having many properties, is part of the structure of War and Peace at the Stand for Your Makeup Mirror is a perfect example of that. Yeah, I'm sure Tolstoy would be happy about that. So this capacity to situate one object in relation to many possible uses, or to grasp an object as having many properties that are all part of the same object, is what makes up this structure of experience as being made up of things, whereas the chimpanzee and other animals just have a grasp of aspects of the environment as affording certain behaviors or preventing other behaviors. So it's just, there's no sort of experience of the tree branch as potentially a grasping tool or some other object being used in some other circumstance as fitting into many different possible uses or having many different properties. Okay, let me just see if let's read the next bit, and then that might be the last one for today, because I have some other things I need to get to. So I can read this one. Kuila indicates that the visual structures of the high and the low, as well as the vertical and horizontal coordinates, are coupled with the upright position. In fact, the child does not acquire them before standing up, and in chimpanzees who do not possess them, the upright position never becomes a natural attitude. The considerable development of the cerebellum and the labyrinth in the chimpanzee evidently corresponds to these two traits of its behavior. But what exactly is the relation between these three facts? It is indeed, if you wish, because of the visual infirmity and of the privilege of proprioceptivity that the upright position remains an exceptional attitude. However, it will be contrary to the spirit of Gestalt theory to explain the mode of locomotion of the monkey by the development of the labyrinth and the cerebellum. If one recalls how Kuila conceived of the relations of anatomy and physiology, it will be necessary to say that this anatomical peculiarity itself is not separable in the genesis of a mode of total functioning of the organism to which it contributes. It is clear that the same reasoning is valid concerning the visual infirmity of the chimpanzee. The three concordant facts which we are recalling are not three events external to each other. All three have the same meaning. All three express a single structure of organic function, a single style of existence. They are three manifestations of a behavior adapted to the immediate and not to the virtual, functional values and not the things. According to the very principles of Gestalt theory, this behavior must be understood in its immanent law, not explained by a plurality of separate causes. And the insufficiency of the static structures in monkeys should not be presented as a quote-unquote visual infirmity. This is to give the impression that a deficiency is possible which does not have its reason in the global structure of behavior. It is to return to the old psychology of contents. Beyond the quote-unquote immovable forms which are at the disposal of the chimpanzee, a level of original conduct must be accepted in which the structures are still more disengaged, transposable from one meaning to another. This is symbolic behavior in which the thing structure becomes possible. Right. So yeah, this is basically just a summary of what we've been talking about, but also a little bit of sort of philosophy of science or philosophy of psychology in particular. And so there's this sort of requirement of an adequate psychology that it understands something as opposed to just explaining it in terms of causes. And so this is like, there's a sort of a classic distinction that, for example, Dilthey makes between understanding as a sort of humanistic grasp of something in terms of meaning. There would be certain, like the Geisteswissenschaften is the German term. So like social sciences and humanistic studies, for example, would grasp the meaning of something as opposed to natural sciences that explain things in terms of causes. And here, so this conception of psychology would situate psychology on the side of the Geisteswissenschaften, the human or spiritual sciences, I guess you could say. So these are so when we do psychology, we're aiming towards grasping a meaning as opposed to explaining something in terms of causes on this conception of psychology. And so when we look at what the chimpanzee or other animals are doing, how they behave, what things they're capable of learning and what things they aren't capable of learning, the goal is not to sort of figure out what are the causes of this of these capacities and incapacities in terms of which brain regions are bigger or smaller. The goal is to grasp the structure of this behavior as something that we can understand, as something that has a meaning. So yeah, this is obviously not the sort of dominant conception of psychology today, and certainly wasn't when he was writing in the 1930s. So this is a sort of it's not a descriptive sort of account of what psychologists consider themselves to be doing. It's a prescriptive account of what psychologists should be doing. Yeah, it's easy to sort of forget that this book, was written, I think it's 1931 published. Actually no, I can't remember the exact date of publication, but anyway, it's quite early. This is the types of experiments that he's describing are relatively unsophisticated experiments. So yeah, it's good to sort of keep that in mind as we're reading sometimes, because like a lot of these arguments are things that people are still talking about today. So yeah, it's interesting. I think that he was writing this almost 100 years ago.
One thing I'm trying to understand is what exactly Merleau-Ponty thinks the relation between anatomy and something like a form of behavior is. There was some example from earlier in the book. I went back and some of chapter 1, and he talks about this experiment where they replace some of the nerve fibers, the eye muscles, these monkeys, with some interior nerve fibers, and just kind of switch them out, and then run this reflex test in the dark room, and they introduce somehow a luminous object in the corner of the room, and despite this anatomical position, the reflex, which is the eye immediately going to the luminous object, remain the same. And it kind of seems like something, I don't know, this last passage talks about the relations between anatomy and physiology and refers to a style of existence. I don't know. It's in some cases it seems like he thinks that there's a kind of priority of the. Well, I mean, I guess this was sort of the thrust of earlier parts of the chapter, but there's maybe not even explanatory priority, but in some cases a kind of top-down effect on anatomy from this equilibrium or more broadly, I guess, form of behavior. Hopefully he goes into this a bit more later.
Yeah, I think you can understand this as a kind of vitalist project in a certain respect. And here, I mean, vitalism generally has a sort of bad reputation as it's just sort of positing this unexplainable vital force as like a sort of quasi explanation. So if you treat vitalism as a kind of explanatory strategy, if you say like this phenomenon is caused by a vital force, then of course you're not really explaining anything. You're just taking the problem and giving it a name and treating that as an explanation. So this type of sort of rejection of vitalism is sort of quite common and was prevalent at this time that he was writing as well. But we can think of vitalism as more of like a project of grasping an organism's behavior and functioning and etc. as part of a sort of ongoing project. Each organism is trying to continue its own existence and reproduce and protect its offspring in certain cases. In mammals, for example, the organisms operate in such a way that a lineage survives and persists through time. Essentially, they have these sort of projects, I guess we can say, of continuing to exist, to find food, to escape predators, etc. And we should understand the way that an organism navigates the world and how its organs operate and so on. We should understand all these things in relation to this project, or these multiple projects in some cases. This idea of a style of existence in some sense is quite vague. What is exactly what is the style of existence of a chimpanzee, for example? But the sort of, we can think of this not so much as like an answer as opposed to a question. When we talk about the style of existence, yes, the chimpanzee style of existence is definitely not structural engineering or architecture or anything like that. So the chimpanzee style of existence, when we sort of want to understand the style of existence of a chimpanzee, this is not an answer to a question. Like if we do a bunch of experiments and then we say, the explanation for all these experimental results is the chimpanzee style of existence, then we're not really explaining anything. But instead, what we want to do is to try to put all these different experimental results of what chimpanzees learn how to do and what they don't learn, sort of to grasp all of those results as one structure, to be able to understand in this sort of, I guess, existential sense that we can grasp this and find meaning, we can sort of see it as meaningful, that chimpanzees are capable of learning some things and not others. So yeah, I think this is, we can, at a sort of more meta level, we can understand this sort of vitalist project as itself a kind of instance of what it's describing, right? So like human beings have a variety of life projects, many more kinds of life projects than chimpanzees do. And one of those projects is precisely the project of understanding chimpanzees and other animals. And so like what we do when we study animals is trying to sort of pursue a life project and so give meaning to something that that we are studying. And so yeah, this is sort of a vitalism as a project, as a certain sort of mode of existence of a human being, as opposed to like a way of explaining something, which in which case it's sort of empty.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. And sort of say one other thing that I, trying to figure out in mind. He talks about these different forms of behavior, and it seems to me that at least with the syncretic and amovable forms, you could have animals that are in some cases their behavior is syncretic, in some cases it is amovable. He's hinted a couple of times at this kind of reflexive effect of this idea of a structured whole perceptual situation, which we have to take into account in order to understand physiology. And I wonder what the effect of that is going to be on symbolic life. I mean, obviously, the examples that you gave about like pupil dilation are not, it's not like being able to speak will prevent you from having reflex effects. But I wonder, it seems like it would be more difficult to draw the line between symbolic forms of behavior and other sort of reflexive behaviors that occur within the life of a symbolic being, I guess, even just by virtue of the fact that every experience would have to be at least pre-linguistic in some sense. But I assume he'll get into this in the next section.
Yeah, you can think like these are obviously very like he's explaining these as like three different levels or three different forms of behavior, but they're all integrated with each other in a sense. So you can think of like, so he talks about the tennis player, for example. So like being able to hit the tennis ball with your racket is a sort of bodily relationship to a dynamic environment. It's the kind of thing that is almost impossible to explain. Like you can write books about tennis. They give you like tips on how to play better tennis, but like studying a bunch of tennis books is not going to make you into a tennis master. But at the same time, tennis, of course, is a kind of symbolic structure. It has like rules of like you get so many points for doing this. This person goes first, and then the other person responds, and then you switch places, and so on. It has all these sort of symbolic rules, and tennis as a sort of social institution is part of like we grasp it as part of the more general practice of sport and competition, and there's like international competitions like the Olympics and so on, all these other broader sort of social institutions that tennis fits into. And so it only makes sense, like someone who is only capable of this, or if you like picture an entity, I don't know, some sort of superpowered chimpanzee or whatever that was like perfectly capable of hitting a tennis ball with a racket, just as well as someone who plays in the French Open or whatever. But had no sort of like symbolic grasp of like what it is to win a tennis game, why what whose turn it is, how many points you have, etc. Who like didn't grasp any of the symbolic aspects of playing tennis, then like this is obviously not this entity, this tennis chimpanzee or tennis robot or whatever is not playing tennis in the sort of true sense of the term. It's just sort of responding to like a tennis ball flying towards it in this precise way. So yeah, like even the behaviors that in some sense are explicable in terms of these amovable forms, they're sort of integrated into a structure that is organized at the symbolic level, in the case of human beings especially. So yeah, these and you can even think of like some of the I don't think pupil dilation is one of them, but there are certain like sort of basic physiological responses that you can actually learn how to manipulate. So like there's like sort of famous. Some of these stories are exaggerated or sort of apocryphal, but there's accounts of certain like yoga experts that are capable of reducing their heart rate to a very low rate or body temperature and so on, and like kind of putting themselves in a quasi suspended animation state. So they've learned this capacity through some sort of symbolic practice of understanding how to how to manipulate your bodily responses at will, or like to subordinate certain physiological responses to a sort of symbolic understanding of the relationship between yourself and this spiritual experience or whatever. So yeah, you can sort of manipulate your own bodily responses in relation to something that you grasp symbolically in certain respects, even in cases that seem quite sort of automatic for most of us, that most of us are not capable of like changing our body temperature, for example. But it's something that we can learn how to do, through this sort of spiritual exercise, I guess you could call it. Sometimes it's like breathing manipulation and things like that. But yeah, you can even very unconscious and seemingly automatic activities or functions of our body can be subject to this kind of direction at the more symbolic level. Cool. So if there are no sort of final questions or comments, then we can wrap up here for today.
That sounds good to me. Thanks, Nan. Thanks, everyone. Talk to you next week.
Yeah, thanks everyone. See you next time.